Wawa, as we say on the continent. West Africa wins again. It always has, does, and will do. I believe the tale to follow supports this regional catchphrase. Peter van der Hoek, who we shall now refer to as Peter, had been a member of the South African Defense Forces for 25 years. As mandatory retirement neared, Peter joined a company named Executive Solutions. Their mission statement was basically to prop up whichever tottering African regime could pay the most for their highly specialized services. It was lucrative and hungry for seasoned soldiers like Peter, trained in a multitude of lethal arts and years of experience. A 43-year-old man who could split the spine of the most spirited 20-year-old street brawler in under 10 seconds. His face deeply scarred cheekbones, to say nothing of the one which curled around his neck, to say nothing of his Arctic blue eyes, sensed the message he might be a foolish man to trifle with, and indeed he was. War was what he knew. No, he was no psychopath. He had loved the same woman for 10 years, and she loved him too, but with a wisp of resignation, and this caused his very real heartache. As for their 2 daughters, Peter would look right through you when you asked how they were. They were his treasure, and he guarded their privacy and safety implacably. Not a man for small talk was Pete, but a good man just the same. To those who ask, how can a man be good and a warrior at the same, I say take it up with your philosophers. Once you know the adrenaline of battle, what fog of war actually means, it is beyond, you cannot grasp it. Peter took the war like a drug, as many men do. He did not engage in cruelty for its own sake, or participate or countenance the murder of women and children unless they were firing at him, as sadly had so often become the case as of late. As for any higher cause he might be fighting for, well, that had become a joke undeserving of a smile, especially in West Africa. He had been called to a country currently being shredded by what was a tribal conflict, and the press insisted on calling a civil war, as though that gave it sense. The president belonged to a tribe which made up 20% of the population and had stolen an election by the simple expedient of shooting up polling stations and arresting his opponents. Other tribes had objected and taken up weapons against the government, and now, after the government had paid his company with a safe filled with gold bars, Peter was going to shore his excellency up, if he could. The omens were not good. The capital held the appeal of all West African cities. Poverty and rot and bedlam, only minus the bedlam. At least there was always music in West Africa. Now there was silence. Faces hid and peered from behind doors and moldering walls of corrugated iron. Fresh bullet holes had ripped walls to pieces. No pedestrians, only military vehicles Peter could see flash across side streets. This president was barely 30 himself and was clinging power out of terror by the use of terror. I should not write a new story. The waves of machine gun fire which thundered across the city reminded him of waves of aircraft. "What's that gunfire?" Peter asked the mute military mentor who'd been sent to bring him to his meeting with one Major Maliamungo. The driver pretended to be a deaf mute. "I just asked you a fucking question, man. I won't ask again. What's the shooting?" The soldier turned with a petulant look and then back at the road when he saw the barrel of an AK-47 pointed casually at his midsection and the finger which could make that barrel spit hot death casually beating time about an inch from the trigger, which would make just that happen. The driver pulled up his shoulders poutingly, part salute and shrug, and replied,
"It's the president's birthday,"
he declared. Peter loudly thumped the stock of his rifle to show their spat was over. "And that's all you're authorized to say, yeah?" The driver turned to him and smiled.
"Yes, sir. That's all I'm authorized to tell you."
Both men sharing a laugh as the soldier took yet another turn. Next to the building, the waves of gunfire were issuing from, and the soldier hopped out, yelling,
"Mr. Major, sir!"
Peter followed. Some voices were heard. Then a solitary, very muscular man in neat and pressed fatigues and sidearm appeared. He nodded, and they confirmed they were who they were and where they were supposed to be.
It's my suggestion we go into the stadium briefly to pay respects to His Excellency, if you're amenable, my friend.
Maliamongo smiled a blindingly radiant grin of perfectly even white teeth and had skin like black velvet. The only thing which marred his dignified face were 3 scars across his left cheek, showing him to be one of the presidential tribe. Sure, lead on, mate, Peter gestured. His mission was to decide if this was a regime which could be saved. Maliamongo was clearly a professional soldier. Peter could recognize his own kind, but the president would be another matter. Peter had seen some doozies in his day. He remembered the coat of glittering medals worn by His Excellency and President for life, conqueror of the British Empire in general and Africa in particular, lord of the fish of the sea and birds of the air, Ph.D. Esquire Field Marshal General Idi Amendada. Another maniac had called himself the Unique Miracle and sat on a throne made of the skulls of his enemies. The president of the country he was currently in was a sergeant who grabbed an opportunity to disembowel his predecessor and call it revolution. Fortunately, he'd only added Doctor and General to his name thus far. As Peter and the Major entered the wide doors of that landmark of every African capital, the football stadium, Peter's heart sank. Maliamongo gently touched his shoulder to signal he will go no further for now. From where he stood, Peter could see a line of posts with men in stained and bloody underpants strapped to them, their eyes bulging with terror. Through loudspeakers, Peter could hear that old classic. Those were the days, my friends. I thought they'd never end. As men dressed in Santa Claus outfits part marched, part staggered onto the field, guns resting at their shoulders. So, Peter softly asked, his face giving nothing away, why the Santa Claus costumes? Equally imperturbable, the Major stared ahead and softly replied,
Christmas is His Excellency's favorite holiday.
Aha. Peter nodded. He does know it's the middle of May, right? Maliamongo turns to him with an impassive face, but bright, smiling eyes.
I expect he does, my friend.
Fire!
The man Peter presumed was the Santa-in-Chief called. Predictably, some shots went wild. Others hit men in the bellies and legs, leading to pitiful cries and wails. The desultory crowd of about 200 bystanders rose to their feet and cheered, shaking their fists. Only a precious few lucky men dangled limp and dead from headshots. King Santa, as Peter now thought of him, pulled out a sidearm and walked up to each survivor and shot them directly in the temple. Now Peter could see the president himself. He was reasonably unostentatious. He was a short and broad-shouldered man like many of his tribe, and wore standard khaki fatigues and mirrored sunglasses and a red beret. Behind him, a tall, skinny woman fanned him, while another offered him a Budweiser, which His Excellency waved off. He was surrounded by similarly clad and deeply unfriendly-looking men, all sharing 3 scars on their cheeks and reflective shades. The president rocked his head side to side and gnawed his lip and clutched his temples, his body swaying softly side to side. As a fellow sufferer, Peter could identify the malady right away. Migraines. Oh shit. On the best of days, dictators are not easy to chat with. One with a migraine could be as dangerous as a lion. The Major turns to Peter, and much to his relief, said,
Perhaps the formal meeting can be postponed until after you file your report, yeah? Tomorrow we'll go into the bush to give you a closer look. Agreed?
Sounds good to me, mate, Peter answered. Just my hotel for now, couple whiskeys and sleep. Bit of jet lag, yeah? Maliamongo nodded firmly, and they walked to the street.
Oh, now where'd that damn fool driver get to?
The taxi's fine, Peter said, though Maliamongo looked doubtful.
A lot of tension in town now. Army discipline breaking down fast since the port fell to rebels last week. So, you are South African?
Maliamongo asked, offering Peter a cigarette, which he accepted. Cheers, Peter murmured, as the Major lit him up. Well, my mother was American, and my dad was South African. I was born at a festival in California at a place called Altamont. Mother loved the Stones, you see. quite sure the Major had no clue what he was talking about. It was thus much to his surprise that the Major boomed out in a rich, melodious voice.
I rode a tank, held the general's rank as the blitzkrieg raged and the bodies stank.
Both men finished in powerful harmony. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. Both laughed and high-fived each other when the Major suddenly brought 2 fingers to his lips for a piercing whistle, and a crumbling taxi veered towards them around potholes you could break your leg in. So, tomorrow, 0600, yeah? Peter asked.
Yes, sir,
The Major replied, giving Peter a light-hearted salute, which Peter returned. Peter wished he could say this was the last of the drama that day, but alas, no. The taxi driver gazed around the streets in terror and clutched the wheel for dear life as they drove deeper into the city. They had reached an ominous deserted square of buildings pockmarked with fresh bullet holes when a soldier staggered in front of their taxi, raised his rifle, and bellowed, "Stop."
Get out the car, white man. Get out. Where your pass? Show why your pass.
The soldier's eyes were yellowish, suggesting malnutrition and malaria. The red suggested scotch and ganja. Peter meekly stepped out of the taxi with his hands raised, just as if this damned lunatic deserved deference and respect.
You no go a pass. You damn fucking CIA. Open the trunk. Now!
Pounding the trunk of the taxi.
The latch. It does not work, Excellency.
The taxi driver squeaked, utterly petrified. But the soldier had lost interest and was swaying side to side. His half-mad eyes locked on Peter.
Get out 6 feet, white man.
He snarled. Translation: step 6 feet away from me, so when I empty my chamber into you, I won't get blood sprayed all over my nifty uniform. Peter feigned incomprehension. 60? You want $60? Leaning in as though to hear the soldier better. The brief pause when the soldier's expression went from lunatic to speculative was all Peter needed. He grabbed the barrel and yanked the soldier toward him and smashed his palm directly into his windpipe. The soldier fell to the dust with bulging eyes, grasping his throat and gagging for breath. Peter leapt into the back seat and shouted, "Go!" and the driver did just that. That night, Peter eased his nerves with a couple shots of whiskey and called his daughters on Skype. They battled each other with volume to prove which one loved him the most. "Makes no difference," Peter said in a snooty voice. "It's not possible for a knight to love one princess more than another. And am I still your knight, my babies?"
Yes, Daddy.
They chorused with the same unity and vigor with which he and Mr. Malamungu had earlier pledged sympathy for the devil. His wife told him not to forget she loved him too, with that same expression of impending loss that always tore at his heart. "Now, you 2 princesses mind the queen of the castle, and maybe I'll bring you a present, yeah?" Then signed off with his queen. Peter couldn't be bothered with marriage. She agreed and preferred queen to wife anyway. After hanging up, he felt a wave of nameless horror. Well, not quite nameless, but the terror that he'd spoken to his 3 angels for the first time. He'd felt it before. It came with the job. He wiped some moisture from his icy Arctic blue eyes and fell onto his fragrant hotel bed and let the scuttling of the colossal cockroaches infesting his room lull him to sleep. The Major was punctual and gave him a friendly slap on the shoulder as 3 jeeps of very well-armed and very serious-looking troops appeared at 6 a.m. sharp for Peter's estimates of the bush around the capital. As they roared off into the jungle, Peter watched the horizon through binoculars. He saw one line of teenagers sprint into the jungle about a half-mile away. Children dragging rifles larger than themselves. Many wore grotesque rubber Halloween masks or were decked out in drag. One fellow was bedecked in a brand-new wedding dress. On a continent which accepts magic like Westerners accept oxygen, they were all dripping with fetishes and amulets to deflect danger from themselves.
Yeah, I see them.
Malamungu said beside him.
Too small a group for us to break ranks for. Want your intelligence briefing, my brother? We are up against the armies of the General Cutthroats. General Number 1 Killer. Captain Tupac. Colonel Fuck Me Quick. You understand?
Peter did. It was the forces of tyranny versus the forces of anarchy. Take your pick. The convoy pulled up into the dusty center of a village of mud walls and straw roofs, like 1,000 other African villages Peter had seen in his life. What was different was the chipper major jumping out of the jeep and reaching into the back to pull out a bundle of toys and candy and t-shirts and a brand new soccer ball, which he began to expertly kick down the so far empty village street.
Come on! Who here in Tylerville can take on the big bad army man, And you men!
He shouted to his stone-faced escort.
Stop acting like Frankenstein and get out and have some fun!
The transformation was instant. The impassive and lethal-looking soldiers instantly transformed into laughing teenage boys, soon joined by more and more children from the village. An impromptu soccer game broke out between the army and the urchins. One unfortunate soldier was assigned to learn hopscotch from a sweet-faced but very serious little girl, who did not hesitate to wag an admonishing finger every time the soldier botched one of the arcane rules. Peter decided that he liked Major Malamungo very much. Then the mood abruptly changed. Drums came from a path cutting through a nearby trail, and a creature that made Peter catch his breath emerged. It wore the wildest ritualistic outfit Peter had ever seen. Feathers bloomed behind it, and for eyes it had what appeared to be 2 solid black balls, a breastplate of segmented dark brown. In its hands it held 2 thorny, sharp-looking sticks with what appeared to be pincers at the end. Another pair of similar sticks protruded from its hips, and 2 more down near its ankles. It danced jerkily, almost spasmically, with none of the rhythmic ease and grace of every African dance Peter had seen. This shaman, perhaps, was dancing like it was having a seizure, ignoring the beat of the drummers that followed in its wake. And it made straight for Peter.
Wanna come.
It rasped and dragged one of its bristly sticks over Peter's cheek. He was still astonished when he heard an explosive bastard from behind him, and watched Malamungo smash his rifle butt into the shaman's belly. As he fell, Peter felt the breastplate brush him. It managed to be both hard yet rubbery, and supple at the same time, almost fleshy. Peter repressed a shudder. The youthful joy of the soldiers dissolved instantly, and they were furiously on the shaman, stomping and kicking him, smashing their rifle butts into his body. Peter had seen the lazy and casual cruelty of far too many African armies to care to remember, but these men were focused and furious. It was as though scratching Peter had been equal to assaulting their grandmothers.
Forgive me, Peter. I am your host and you are my guest, and I want you to have a positive visit here. But I cannot, will not, suffer this man to live. Please do not interfere.
With that, the major pulled out his sidearm and fired a shot near where the man's head should be, and the river of blood which followed suggested just that. But the man rolled to his belly and began to strongly pull himself away, looking like nothing so much as an enormous spider with chicken feathers pulling itself along an enormous web. The major cursed and shot again, and though he slowed still, the man pulled himself forward. Soon, 3 soldiers who had located some snake clubs and machetes sprinted past the major and smashed and hacked at the shaman until he finally lay still. The soldiers backed up quickly, eyes not leaving the corpse.
Load up, pull out.
The major barked at everyone, Peter included, obeyed, hopping into the jeeps and tearing down the bush trail until finally arriving at a deserted village covered with graffiti, which made rude comments about the president and his lineage and endowments. A liberated rebel village, she supposed. As Peter and the men gathered around the fire and cooked some porridge for supper, the men had distant and troubled looks on their faces. Not discussing the bloody incident would appear to be by mutual consent. Until later that night, as Peter and the major lay on bedrolls in one of the larger straw huts, Peter watched the crickets and snakes and spiders infesting the straw above him act out their mysterious rituals. "My, what the fuck was that?" he said in a tone which signaled a bullshit reply would not be tolerated. Malamungo sighed.
That shaman was even worse than the worst rebel. There is what do you call it? A cult. They worship a monster they call the bonobo spider. I remember my grandfather speaking of it, but I thought it was to keep me from being naughty. But the people around here swear the bonobo is real. If it is, then you and me, my friend, we are below it on the food chain. That son of a bitch both worships that devil and cursed you with it. Once touched by its leg, it will attract the spider itself to you.
"Yeah, but," Peter retorted, "that was no spider leg. Come on, mate. Give the other one a pull. That was a tree branch."
I hope so,
said Major Malamungo in a hopeless voice. "So why exactly are they in such awe of this spider?" Peter couldn't refrain from asking. Malamungo sighed.
Well, of course the size is one factor. It is about 5 or 6 feet with its legs extended, but that is the very least of what makes it so awful. The bonobo spider, despite being massive, can flatten itself to slide through cracks you would think only a mouse could manage. Like every spider, it likes warmth and damp and dark, and the bonobo prefers animals for its own shelter, their insides. Eventually the spider grows to full size and controls its host like a puppeteer. Once it has laid its eggs to feast on the inner organs, it will exit the host just like a passenger stepping off a bus. That man me and my men killed today serves that thing, or the idea of it anyway. I make no apology for it.
"None needed, Major," Peter said. He was no arachnophobe. An arachnophobic African soldier was, by definition, useless, but this legend was monstrous. The thunder boomed outside, and soon the patter of rain overhead sent Peter and Malamungo into a sleep so deep that neither woke to the sound of the thick, bulging black shadow dragging itself into their hut. Exhausted by crushing humidity and the overall strangeness of the day, an intangible sense of wrongness that seemed both inescapable and all-consuming to his highly sensitive soldier's antenna, Peter lay back in the hut, idly brushing insects large and small off him as they poured and fell from the damp straw walls and ceiling of their shelter. This was not a new experience to him, far from it. The children in their torn wedding gowns or miniskirts, heads adorned with platinum blonde wigs or the scalped hair of their victims, lavish shaman masks or grotesque rubber Halloween masks concealing their face from unwelcome cameras or from themselves, from the atrocities they had committed, atrocities which forever exiled them beyond the pale of civilized society and any hope of forgiveness. They guarded roadblocks built with long strands of human intestine, their bodies dripping with fetishes and amulets which they believed made them immune from bullets, their minds fogged by a potent drug of equal parts cocaine and gunpowder, or heroin or PCP, all provided by the man in the Armani suit and distinguished educated accent. Their new father, who forced them to murder their own fathers, assault and kill their own sisters and mothers, as he smiled and sipped his Chivas Regal and puffed his expensive cigar, devilishly pleased as he damns them forever, and all the drugs and amulets could never bury that ugly truth deeply enough in their young minds. And so they fought with a suicidal bravery against the armies of the corrupt generals who fought to defend a madman holed up in the executive mansion deep within the ruined capital. This pungent fog of nihilism and cruelty was painfully familiar to the South African mercenary. And yet Peter felt that while the two sides battled for the bloodiest cause, the lust for power, something else was studying them. Certainly not God. Peter was no believer and felt sure that were there a God then, he would not be found here. No, but Peter sensed another presence, a colder and utterly alien intelligence, preceding their absurd human antics and waiting for the moments to what? Harnessed by this floating anxiety, Peter slapped a large hissing cockroach which was trundling down his cheek away and fell into a deep but uneasy sleep. Across from him, Major Maliamungo sat bolt upright with military rigidity and scanned the entrance of their hut with the regularity of a prison yard searchlight, his keen, intelligent eyes, their whites unmarked by the yellow malarial hue that afflicted so many of his countrymen, scarcely blinked. Hours passed, yet Maliamungo sat in patient serenity, necessary to any man who plans to remain sane in this country. When at last it happened. A large, bloated shape, blacker than the night surrounding it, pulled its bulk into the hut on legs like thick steel cables. A razor-thin smile cut across the Major's face, and he placed his hand with fingers splayed wide over his heart.
Mother,
He whispered in a voice choked with something which sounded nearly like love. Across the hut, Peter sweated and tossed in restless slumber. For Peter had a visitor too. A visitor that perched its thick legs covered in stiff, wiry hair on Peter's ribcage. Its own bloated abdomen sank complacently into the warm fluids of Peter's viscera, indifferent to the pitiful whimpers of its host. It too had mastered the art of endless patience and stillness. Only the slightest ripple coursed through its body when it sensed its mate was near, a sensation which, in its own inhuman and alien way, was also not entirely dissimilar to love. The black tropical night gave way to a dusty yellow African dawn, and Peter jerked awake, teeth clenched against a scream. What in the devil had woken him? Something repetitive, something maddening. It took him uncommonly long to focus, but then he heard it. Deep in the nearby jungle, he heard a chorus of innocent children's voices chanting. Rebels, and not far. But insanely, Peter recognized that nothing could have concerned him less. Something was wrong, deeply and horribly wrong, and these violated, ruined children had nothing to do with it. The next morning, Peter awoke and felt awful. Feverish. No, he'd had malaria on and off most his life, and this wasn't it. The men were standing around in shorts eating breakfast. Most wore flip-flops for now, delaying the inevitable pinch of the boots and scratched fatigues. Peter was seeing double. He tried to circle around a hut to piss, but his body disobeyed him entirely and jerked him toward the men. His head snapped back and his nostrils flared. He could smell it. The blood flowing rapidly through these men, and fats and internal organs, which he'd never known had an aroma. Such a succulent aroma. Now the men had noticed him, eyes narrowing at the white man walking in such a jerky, unnatural way, with eyes bulging like bloody, swollen eggs.
Peter!
He heard a faintly familiar voice shout.
Are you alright? What is with you?
Then, Peter pulled into a defensive posture as he heard the sound of bullet clips being slammed home into automatic rifles. He crouched and crept, or rather scuttled from side to side, taking in all the men with vision which seemed both wider and blurrier. His mouth dropped like a loose trap and whimpered, but the whimper was drowned out by a far louder and angrier hiss. An explosion of gunfire tore through the early morning air, and Peter's body danced above the dusty ground, his skin shredding. In his mind he saw his girls staring blankly at him, saw their sides bulging as thick black legs, spindly and hairy, broke through their skin. And then the darkness swallowed him. The men circled his body slowly, every rifle trained on his corpse. Then, suddenly, with a loud snap of a breaking jaw, Peter's mouth fell open. A thick nest of bent black legs filled the gap between his lips, and the massive fronts of the arachnid pulled itself forward into the light, shining and dripping with Peter's dissolving and destroyed organs. The giant's mandibles clacked audibly like two human leg bones being struck together, and the massive upper body scuttled side to side, never letting the soldiers out of its sight. Meanwhile, its gorged and dripping abdomen slowly and silently emerged from between Peter's blue lips. It took 3 containers of gasoline and 2 grenades to finally kill the monster. On the ride back to the capital, Major Maliamungu slipped his reflective sunglasses over his swollen and aching eyes. In 2 days, His Excellency, the President, would be addressing the UN General Assembly. Major Maliamungu would be the head of his security detail. He had always wanted to visit New York City, and so did his children. He smiled. He had so many children, after all.